Tonight, I will be telling 5 stories, starting things off with some fast food horror and moving into a chilling train ride, a cursed mirror, demented snowmen, and closing things off with a long tale of a sketchy small town. This video has some truly terrifying stories. A huge thank you to the incredible authors who allowed this video to be possible. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I've worked at McDonald's for a little over a year now, just to make some money throughout high school. I started working there as a senior with the intent to quit within a few months, but I actually enjoyed it and decided to continue after I graduated. I decided to go to a community college near my parents' house, so it wouldn't be a problem to keep working at the same place. I still moved into an apartment so I could have more freedom. A week ago, my manager told me that there was an opening for a night shift job if I was interested. I would only be working 6-hour shifts, 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., while making the same amount of money I would from working a 10-hour shift during the day. I don't have any classes until 1 p.m., so this sounded like a great opportunity to have more free time while still making the same amount of money. I graciously accepted the offer, and he told me that I could start that night, and there would be a set of rules on the counter when I got there. I thanked him and left, finding it a little weird that someone had quit with such short notice that they needed someone the next night. After my last class, I decided to head home and take a nap before I had to leave. I slept for a couple hours before my alarm woke me up at 10:15. After laying in bed for a few minutes, I got ready for work and left. The drive there was nothing like it had been with a morning shift. The road I took was usually filled with traffic, making it nearly 15 minutes to get there, even though it is a few miles away from my apartment. At night, I arrived within 5 minutes, so I was 15 minutes early for my shift. There were 2 employees there, and they asked if they could leave early since I was there. I accepted, even though my partner hadn't arrived yet. She was also taking the night shift for the first time, and we already kind of knew each other. We had a class together and talked occasionally, but now I would get to know her better. The list of rules was on the counter, and it was a lot longer than I expected. My partner, Riley, probably wouldn't be there for another 10 minutes, so I began reading the rules. Here's what they said. Rule 1. Do not let anyone in the store between 2:07 and 2:12 a.m. The store is supposed to be open 24/7, but during that time, you are to lock the doors and ignore any noises you hear outside until 2:13. Rule 2. There will be exactly 2 cars in the drive-thru during your shift. For the red truck, you are to give them 2 Happy Meals and a large Pepsi. You may look out of the window, but do not make eye contact with the driver. The meal must already be prepared before the truck shows up. For the blue minivan, make sure you are not seen. Leave the window open and find a hiding spot until they leave. This will take up to 20 minutes. Do not make any loud noises until the car leaves. If any other cars are seen in the drive-thru, stare directly at the driver without speaking. They will stare back and leave soon after. If they do not stare back, hide until you hear them leave. Rule 3. If at any point you hear singing coming from inside the store, close your eyes and breathe as loudly as possible. Do not open them under any circumstances until you hear the front door open and close. Rule 4. You will get various customers throughout the night, and most of them will be harmless. However, a little boy in a green shirt will enter the store sometime during the night. He will give you a very complex order, and it is crucial that you perfect it before serving it to him. He will give you 1 hour to cook the order, and will repeat it when asked to, but do not speak to him unless you are asking him to repeat his order. Do not exceed the time limit, and do not make any mistakes. Rule 5. All of the clocks in the store, including your phone, will change to random times throughout the night. The only times the clocks will be correct are 2:07, 2:12, and 5. Do not let the worker from the next shift in until the clock reads 5. No matter how much they ask to be let in, politely refuse. They will not enter without permission. Rule 6. This is the most important rule. If a normal customer is in danger, don't try to help them. There is no hope, and it will put you in danger too. Customers will die in a variety of ways, including heart attacks, stabbings, and basically any other painful death you can think of. After reading the rules, I stood in shock, not knowing what to do. Riley walked through the doors 2 minutes before our shift began, and I showed her the list of rules. We were both skeptical and kind of excited to see what would happen. I made the Happy Meals in case the truck showed up soon, and it did about 15 minutes later. The list said not to make eye contact, so I just handed over the meals while looking straight down. As it drove away, I noticed something in my peripheral vision. The driver had 4 arms. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear that thing was not human. "Sarah, wake up," was the next thing I remember hearing. I dozed off unknowingly. I looked at the clock, then remembered that it didn't work when I saw it said 9:12 a.m. There was one customer at the store at that point, and he was getting up to leave when he froze. I watched in terror as his skin slowly started to melt off. Riley tried to rush over to him, but I stopped her, remembering Rule 6. There was none showing, and he continued melting until what was left was a pile of slime. It took the form of a snake and slithered out of the door. From that point on, we took the rules seriously. Eventually, the little boy in the green shirt showed up. He ordered probably around 10 burgers, each with different toppings. We took our time preparing the orders, then gave them to him, and he left without trouble. Right after he left, I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the store. After realizing it was singing, I shut my eyes and told Riley to do the same. I breathed loudly and eventually heard the front door open and close. We waited another couple of minutes to be safe, then opened our eyes. There were now 10 people in the store, some of which I had recognized. They all looked at us with confused expressions because we had our eyes closed. Then, they all dropped dead one by one with no explanation. After looking away for a second, the bodies disappeared. I looked at the clock, and it was 2:07. I rushed to lock the doors and did so just before the clock changed. I started to hear tapping on the window closest to us. I made the mistake of looking, and I was met with some kind of zombie staring back at me and smiling. I shut my eyes tight, and the clock said 2:12 when I opened them, meaning it was safe to unlock the doors. About an hour later, a blue minivan pulled into the drive-thru. I hid behind the counter with Riley, and it drove away after maybe 10 to 15 minutes. The rest of the night was uneventful, and the next workers showed up at 5 so we could leave, completely traumatized. I went straight home and cried for hours before checking the news. I thought the deaths we had seen were fake, but the first story I saw was about 11 people being found dead in their homes. I might be sounding paranoid, but please, don't go to McDonald's at night. I was alone on a train, very late one night. I've forgotten where to. Somewhere down south, I think. It was past midnight and there wasn't much to see out the windows. Sometimes when we pulled up by a station, I could see abandoned cats, thin and bristly, playing casually with pieces of trash. The train itself was covered with posters from stuff in New York, where I'd left from. One of the lights kept flickering oddly. Sitting on the other side of the car was an old man, with a long, gray patchy beard, and a green fabric raincoat. He didn't have a newspaper or a book, and he did not appear to be sleeping. He just looked down at his feet with a palpable malaise, as if even lamenting his lot in life was a miserable exercise. I felt uneasy about him, perhaps because I'm not a particularly social person, or perhaps because his decrepit appearance. Nevertheless, we'd been stranded there together alone on that car for nearly an hour. At around the 9-minute mark, he got up and slouched closer to me. I didn't want to be rude, but my muscles instinctively tensed. Something about his hooded yellow eyes triggered the prey instinct in my lizard brain. "Do you mind if I join you?" he asked, and it was with a voice that sounded like it came through a paper wrapper of a straw. You could see blue and red blood vessels all over his yellow papyrus skin. For a moment, I thought he might have jaundice. "Sure," I said, smiling. I didn't want to be rude, especially not to people like this. The train pulled to a stop, but neither of us got off. I was going to visit with an old friend of mine, but she'd had to cancel at the last minute, and so I'd found myself on a long trip with no place to stay. As the train pulled to a halt, a bottle rattled from under his previous seat, making a loud clattering sound. He adjusted his position, perhaps out of discomfort or embarrassment. In doing so, he gave me a whiff of his overpowering odor. It wasn't the mix of sweet, booze, and urine you'd expect from a vagrant, but something else entirely. Something between rancid meat and mildewed shower. I tried not to crinkle my nose. I had nothing I wanted to ask him, and he didn't seem eager to talk either, and I was almost ready to stand and tell him my station was coming up when he asked, "What brings you to these parts?" Oh, well, I had plans to meet someone, but it didn't work out. They seldom do, he mused. They very seldom do. I found that out the hard way. Yeah, well, life's chock full of obstacles, I answered, smiling. He didn't smile, though. His face stayed pensive, as if he were trying to remember the name of an old film. After a few minutes, he cocked an eyebrow. I suppose you want to know what I'm doing here. I didn't particularly, but I had nothing better to do, so I nodded. If it wouldn't be rude for me to inquire, sure. Rude? Don't you have things better to do than worry about being rude? It ain't rude to be curious. Everyone is. He leaned back in his seat for a few moments, and for a little while, I wasn't sure if he was going to say anything. Then finally, with a grunt, he began. The problem, you see, is that life is so damned easy to mess up. In fact, it's so simple, so reflexive, we don't even call it messing up anymore. We say, you made a mistake. It's just part of life. Keep moving on. Doesn't matter that our lives might be in shambles. It's just a little blunder. Some mistakes, though, they aren't part of life. I remember when I was like you, young and adventurous. I was traveling abroad, on a trip, you see. But that really doesn't matter. It could have happened any place. I'd spent my money too freely and found myself without enough cash to get home. Just when I thought I'd be trapped here forever, I ran into a strange man in the lobby of my hostel. He didn't look like your typical smuggler, no. He probably looked like I do now. He let out a cold bark of a laugh. There was some mirth in it, but a desperate kind, like he'd just got the punchline to a joke he previously didn't understand. Well, this man wanted help. There were some things. He said he wanted to move. Not guns, not drugs, but something customs nevertheless. Would not take too kindly to. He offered me $5,000 up front and another $5,000 upon arrival. Because I was desperate and very poor, I agreed. He told me what to do. He gave me this package, a pouch he hadn't sealed, and told me to swallow it, that it had come out in my shit. And, well, that left me with the rather unpleasant job of going through my own shit at some point. I needed to get home, so I took his $5,000 and went to the airport. Once there, I swallowed the package, bought a ticket, and got aboard my flight. It was an uneventful trip, really, and nobody stopped me or bothered me. When I got off the plane, there was another man waiting for me, who handed me another $5,000. He looked nearly identical to the man who'd first handed me the job. After I'd been paid, he disappeared. He left no means by which I could contact him, and didn't ask for the contents of the pouch. It only took a few minutes after landing for my stomach to start acting up. At first, I thought it was nothing, just turbulence or the in-flight food. And when I got home, the symptoms seemed to have abated a little bit, so I took some Alka-Seltzer and went to bed. The next day I felt absolutely terrible. My eyes were sore, and my bones felt as though they were grinding up against each other. The worst part, though, was my skin. It had turned a sort of olive color. I'd grown more hair than usual, on my face and neck. I tried to eat, for I felt very hungry, but nothing I consumed seemed to fill me. I always wanted more. I just ate and ate and ate. Within 4 hours, I'd spent nearly $300 of my money on food, and still could eat more. I had absolutely no desire to defecate, and my limbs only hurt more. By this time, I was nearly sure the stuff I ate must have caused this reaction. Perhaps the package lining had dissolved. Little did I know that that was the intent all along, you see. He chuckled, softly and sadly, like he was remembering a joke that had once been funny, but had lost its humor with years of retelling. Then suddenly he froze, and quivered violently. He looked like an alarm clock going off. "Are you alright?" I asked. Yeah, fine. Perfectly fine," he murmured. But he was off somehow. His skin seemed wrinklier than before, his eyes bigger in their sockets, and his arms hung heavier by his sides. "Look, let me get you some help." "There's no helping me." He said it harshly, as though getting aid was an attack to his religious beliefs. He took a shaky breath, then continued with his tale. "When I awoke the next morning, I felt even worse and looked even worse. I drank as much water as I dared, but did not eat despite my hunger. I felt much better when I was in cool places, which was not good because it was the middle of summer, and those were rare. Finally, that evening, I felt the urge to move my bowels and thought, at last, My suffering was over. If I could get it out of my body, I thought I'd be alright. He smiled wistfully. I shit alright, but what came out wasn't a blob of brown goo. Oh no. What came out squirmed and shrieked and flailed about in the bowl. It was an eel, per se, but think about it along those lines. This was some sort of slimy proto-eel, like what an eel would be before life forms really split up and became their own separate things. For a moment, I thought I'd shat out my own intestines, until I heard it squeal and saw it move. I didn't have time to scream or try and kill it before it swam down the toilet bowl. I don't know where it went. I don't want to know. What happened then? I asked. What? Well, did you see a doctor? Did you pass another? What happened? Oh no, I haven't passed another one. Not since that first one 3 days ago. Sensing my look of confusion, he added, I'm 26 years old. The train pulled to a stop and the man stood. You have a nice trip now, he said, and hobbled off. As the creatures consumed more and more of his flesh and bones, I watched him, fixated, as he stood stock still on the platform, next to a trash can with an old, stray cat on top of it. I couldn't tell who was thinner. I recently moved into a new apartment when I got a new job at the city. It was a small one-bedroom apartment that was good enough to keep me in shelter for the next 3 months. After all, that's the longest I'm expecting this internship to last. Or so I thought. I placed a big mirror on the wall next to my nightstand. It was something I got from a thrift store that I passed by when I was driving from our house. I figured that I needed a mirror because I didn't have one. It didn't seem so eerie when I first saw that mirror. In fact, it looked gorgeous to me. It had a golden frame that was twisted into intricate patterns, like vines creeping on the edges. It was flawless, which made it more worth it. It was exactly a week after I moved in that I stayed up after work and watched TV. Although I didn't see anything worth watching at the time, I can't embrace the idea of heading to bed. But when I did, something made me glance at the mirror. In there, I saw a bicycle being reflected before me. I quickly turned back to see if I left the TV open, but I didn't. Besides, the TV wasn't even facing the mirror, or wasn't even visible on the mirror from the angle that I was at. I shrugged the thought off, thinking it was an illusion. Perhaps it was a way my body was responding to, showing me that I must be tired. I looked at the clock beside my picture frame, and it read 9:30, so I stumbled into my bed and slept a second later. The next morning, I woke up at about 7:30 a.m. It was very unusual for me to wake up that late because I was always on time. This made me hasten as I readied myself for work. I didn't bother to cook for breakfast. I just hurried and decided to buy something on the way there. By 9:15, I was out of the door. I'm pretty sure I knocked over some people while I was running to my office. I didn't even have time to apologize as 9:30 was the start of my busy day. When I was finally crossing the last street before I'd approach our building, the traffic lights signaled go. Even when only a few cars were there, I was obliged to stop. But I was trying to quicken things up and tried crossing half of the road. When I was near the sidewalk, I heard a scream coming from the left side that made me avert my gaze to it. "Move!" screamed the guy who was riding a bicycle that was speeding up towards my direction. My eyes widened as I quickened my step. The bike swiftly moved past me with a strong wind following it. I heard multiple screams behind me before I stared wide-eyed at the man who bumped into some moving car. Blood splattered all over the road as time stopped for me. There was endless ringing inside of my ears. The man riding the bike was dead. He was cut to bits. I also saw how the bicycle broke into pieces. Impossible. I went to work late that day. I tried explaining to my supervisor, but nothing came out of my trembling mouth. I ended up letting him scold me till noon. Although none of what he said slipped into my mind. I was imagining the guy as he screamed at me. How did a bicycle rider lose control of a bike? It was nearly inexplainable to me. I turned my TV off once again after mindlessly staring at it for hours. I stopped as I shifted my gaze to my mirror and saw something in it. It looked like a big cylinder container. Once again, I looked around the house and saw nothing that resembled what was in the mirror. When I looked back at it, it was gone. This is when I started to realize the bicycle that broke into pieces that day was the same bike I saw in the mirror the night before. I was sure of it. Spooked out by what I realized, I got into my bed and buried my head into my pillow. As I moved around, I glanced at the time and saw 9:30. The next day, I got to work hurriedly. By 9 a.m., I was already at my office. My boss was amused by this, and to express his amusement, he asked me to take the scratch papers to the storage room up the rooftop. I couldn't do much about this though, so I gathered the papers in a cardboard box. I then took the elevator up the rooftop and walked towards the storage room. The room was partly open, so I had no problem accessing it. I went in and placed the box on the corner. Just when I was about to head out, the corner of my eyes caught something that made me stop and turn back at whatever it was. Just meters away from where I placed the box, a black, big cylinder container stood innocently. A wave of nostalgia passed through me, as I remembered what I saw in the mirror the night before that. The sun peeking through the door shone on the container in a manner that made me walk closer to it. I held the top of the thing and tried opening it out of curiosity. It was hard and harder to open, but after about 2 minutes, I managed to lift the cover. When I did, the first thing that was realized was a stench of stale blood and rotting flesh. I held my breath and resisted the urge to vomit as I peeked inside. I screamed as loud as I could once I made out its contents. I stormed out of the room and into the elevator. My heart was pounding against my chest as the image of the rotting, mutilated body that was stashed into that container crossed my mind. A picture of violence that I've never imagined I would see in the premises of my workplace. I immediately called 911 and reported what I saw. Minutes later, the cops were putting caution tape around the storage room. I was still stunned by what I saw, that I cried my eyes out. My boss advised me to take my day off and get back to work when I felt better, so I did. I went into the apartment and glared at the mirror that laid innocently on the wall. I grabbed the hammer under my bed and started breaking the mirror as I cried a river. I made sure at the end of the day that it was smashed to bits. But just when it was into pieces, something impossible started to happen before my eyes. The broken pieces floated and combined like liquid, forming back into a neat, flawless mirror. I stood there in awe as my eyes averted to the nightstand and saw something equally impossible. My clock showed 9:30. Once again, I grabbed the hammer and I smashed my alarm clock 5 times. But like what happened to the mirror, it turned back into what it was and showed 9:30 once again. This time, I felt the urge to look at my mirror, and what it showed drained the life out of me. There, in the mirror, I saw a knife held by a guy who wore a pizza delivery uniform. The creepiest part of this picture was how his beady black eyes stared at me, complemented by his grin that literally stretched ear to ear. My knees feebled and I fell to the floor as my tears streamed in silence. I couldn't scream anymore. I couldn't even move. I leaned at the end of my bed and started typing this. Right now, I'm still on the edge of my bed, afraid of what might happen in the next few hours. I stayed here from night till morning, as nothing came out of me trying to break through my door. I also tried texting and calling people, but nothing went out. I just hope that something can come here and save me before anything else would come here and harm me. I heard my phone ring that jolted me to stand up. When I grabbed it, I saw a text from my mom. 9:26 a.m.
Hey sweetie, happy birthday. I can't come over because it's really chaotic here in the office, but I ordered a pizza and it's on the way there. I love you, baby.
Then I heard a knock. It's the dead of winter, and here in rural Minnesota, the weather's been pretty much what you'd expect. I'm not too worried about that though. I've lived up here long enough to know how to properly prepare for the season. Plus, since I generally work remotely, I rarely have much reason to leave the house to brave the elements, even when the weather isn't god-awful. As such, I was expecting a rather uneventful few months, bundled up on my couch with my laptop and a steady supply of hot cocoa. The only downside being that I live out here by myself, though I've never been the type to be bothered too much by solitude. However, it would seem I'm not as alone out here as I thought I was. For the past few weeks now, I've been waking up each morning to find that, at some point in the middle of the night, someone has built a snowman somewhere on my property. Every single day I wake up to find a new one without fail. Now this would be weird enough on its own, but as I've mentioned, I live in rural Minnesota. The nearest town is about 20 miles from here, and my nearest neighbor is just over 5. The snow right now is 2 feet deep at a minimum. It's more than a little odd that someone would come out all this way just to build a snowman, let alone in the middle of the night. That being said, it didn't really bother me at first. From what I can tell from the traces left behind, the culprit seems to be a kid around the age of 12 or so. He always comes by way of the forest that spans the land just north of my plot. That in itself was odd, given the fact that I don't recall anyone living up that way. But it's not like I'm the most social person anyway. It wouldn't be a surprise to me if I just didn't hear about them moving in. Besides, they are just snowmen. They aren't exactly the most threatening thing in the world. The snowmen themselves are actually pretty well made too. They're more than a few levels above the clumsily tossed together lumps of snow you'll see outside of some people's homes. Each of the 3 spheres that make up every snowman is perfectly formed, so much so that they almost look manufactured, in a way. The kid didn't spare any expense on decorations either. Each snowman has been outfitted with the works, several bits of clothing such as scarves, mittens, and hats, sturdy branches for limbs, and carefully crafted facial features made from stones and other bits likely retrieved from the forest. Admittedly, I did find the fact that they were all made to be frowning and facing towards my house a little unnerving. I guess I could have just destroyed them or something if they really started to bother me, but I was reluctant to do so. It sort of felt like kicking over a kid's sandcastle on the beach, which, unless you're some kind of sadist, is anything but a good feeling. Besides, they were harmless piles of snow, and it wasn't like they were in the way of anything. Unsettling or not, they still weren't anything worth being seriously worried about. Well, I quickly changed my mind about that last night. After nearly a month of this going on, I was ready to confront this nightly visitor. I'd finished all the work I had needed to get done this week, so I figured there wouldn't be any harm in pulling an all-nighter in order to try and catch the kid in the act. I still wasn't particularly bothered by what the kid was doing, but I was starting to get a bit concerned. The temperature was dropping more and more below 0 each night, and I was starting to worry about the kid's safety. I had my suspicions as to the reasons behind the kid's odd behavior, and I certainly didn't want to deal with the legal troubles it would bring if they died on my property. I'd hoped that the weather would stay clear for my little stakeout, but I wasn't quite so lucky. As afternoon shifted into evening, the clear patch of weather we'd been having for the past couple of weeks came to an end, as a snowstorm rushed over the mountains and bore down on us. By the time night came around, the storm had begun in full. I could barely see more than a few yards out through my window. Even with the high-powered flashlight I had on hand, I figured the kid wasn't going to be able to make his nightly trip in these conditions, but I decided I'd stay up just in case. It wasn't like I had anything better to do anyway. By the time 2 a.m. came rolling around though, I had lost all traces of this previous enthusiasm. I was most of the way through a bottle of wine, and I had long tired of shining my flashlight through my windows, and only seeing the figures of the nearest snowmen. I'd more or less convinced myself that it was about time to give up and turn in for the night. I felt compelled to check one last time though, if only to satisfy that little stubborn bit of my mind that didn't want to admit that I'd wasted an entire evening. God, I wish I had just gone to bed. Drawing in close to one of my windows, I slowly swept my flashlight across the yard. The storm was still going, but the wind had started to die down significantly. It had been fierce, but it seemed as if the storm would be brief too. I figured that there was a good chance it would be done by morning. The visibility had cleared up significantly, and I could now see more of the snowmen that littered my yard. In spite of the previously howling winds, not a single one of them had been tipped over. After slightly melting and then refreezing once more over the couple days and nights, the snowmen had all formed a resilient outer shell of ice. It would take more than a run-of-the-mill blizzard to make them budge. They'd probably last till spring. Somehow, they almost seemed closer to the house than before. Perhaps the decreased visibility was making me a bit claustrophobic or something like that. It's hard to say. I did find it a bit jarring though, all the same. Caught up in my thoughts, I almost didn't notice it. A flicker of movement. Something in between the snowmen that most certainly hadn't been there before. I did a double take, not quite sure if I'd seen what I thought. I swept the beam back over the spot where I'd thought I'd seen it, but it wasn't there anymore. If it had ever been there to begin with, that is. Perturbed, I continued to sweep my flashlight across the lawn. I'd almost convinced myself that my lack of sleep was starting to get to me when I heard something, a rustling just to the left of my window. The beam of my flashlight quickly flitted over to where I thought the sound had come from, but I was only able to just barely catch sight of it before it disappeared around the corner of my house. This time though, I was certain of what I'd seen. A flicker of movement, a human figure, and the smallish bare foot of a child just before it disappeared out of sight. I cursed under my breath, pulling on a coat and a pair of boots. Not only was this kid out in this mess, but he was barefoot, if not worse. Where in the heck were this kid's parents, and why in the heck weren't they keeping a better eye on him? I wasn't exactly eager to throw myself out into the blizzard, but I knew I had to. I wasn't even sure if this kid knew where the heck he was, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let this kid die out there on my lawn. Shivering, I went out my back door. Ducking around to the side of the house I thought the kid was on. I'd hoped he'd be close to the house still, so I wouldn't have to venture too far out into the blizzard. But I wasn't so lucky. I found his tracks. They were quickly being covered by the falling snow, but were still clear enough to tell he'd wandered off further into the blizzard. Letting off more than a few expletives, I hurried off after the kid before I completely lost track of him. I followed the tracks farther out, towards the edge of my property. I debated calling out for the kid but decided not to, worried that I might spook him. I strained my eyes and ears to catch some sort of trace of him, but it wasn't easy in the howling blizzard. The snow muffled everything, the wind drowned everything out, and my flashlight beam could only reach so far. I'd walked for a couple of minutes and all I had seen were the snowmen. The tracks were fading fast, and I was worried I might lose the trail entirely. It was then that I heard it, a sort of rustling and scraping, not unlike a small animal trying to dig itself a burrow. It was the kid. It had to be. I did my best to quiet my steps as I crept closer. We were near the woods at the edge of my property now. I neared the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from behind a few bushes. Quietly making my way around, I swept my light across the edge of the dark forest, hoping that the kid wouldn't run away at the sight of me. You see, I only see it now in retrospect that my entire perception of what had been going on was based on assumptions. I'd come across something unusual and unexplained in my otherwise normal everyday life, and I'd automatically done my best to rationalize it. Sure, I may have felt uneasy about what was going on, but I never felt like I was in any sort of danger. Though, when my flashlight beam settled on that thing hunched over in the snow, I quickly realized that I had been taking things far too lightly. The first thing I realized is that it wasn't just barefoot, it was completely naked. From head to toe there wasn't a thread to be seen anywhere. That was the least of my concerns though, as I realized under further examination that what I was looking at may not even be human. Its skin was white with tinges of blue, barely indistinguishable from the snow around it. Its icy hide was pulled taut over its bony frame, which seemed to almost poke through in spots. Its spine stood out in particular, its bony ridges traveling down its hunched back and leading one's eyes down to its strange, short, and fleshy tail. It had the overall shape and size of a human child, but it was anything but. It was much more than a naked mole rat, or some sort of hairless cat. It was bent over, its gnarled, root-like hands clawing the surrounding snow together and forming it into a large ball. Its movements were frantic and erratic, like a rodent or cockroach scurrying across the floor. It was so outside the realm of anything I was expecting. My mind couldn't figure out how to react. That quickly changed though. The flashlight hadn't alerted the creature, for whatever reason, but I wasn't able to mask my shocked gasp of breath at the sight of it. It froze, and then quickly whipped around to face me. Its face, it wasn't right. The proportions were all off, the eyes too small, the mouth far too big. The nose was practically non-existent. Its beady black eyes were fixed on my own, and its wide mouth, full of teeth like shards of ice, was fixed in a snarl. My mind caught up with itself, and I felt a fearful chill rush through me. It was so much colder than the blizzard around us. It let out a screech not unlike nails on a chalkboard. I screamed right back, falling backwards as I desperately backpedaled away from it. My flashlight flickered like crazy before going out completely. A few frantic smacks got it working again, and I focused it once more on where the creature had been, but it was nowhere to be seen. I had no idea where it went, but I was certainly not sticking around to find out. I rushed back through the snowmen to my house, and I swear, they're all looking at me. Their frowns were deeper, angrier even. I didn't waste any time examining them in any great detail though. Quickly making my way inside the house, I locked all the doors and closed all the curtains and blinds before huddling up on the couch and trying to shiver the chill of fear away. I'd had my fill of beady, black eyes for the evening, on snowmen or otherwise. Thankfully, the night was uneventful after that. I fell asleep at some point, my fatigue overcoming my fading panic. I've been trying to convince myself that last night was all just a bad dream or something like that, but I haven't been quite able to manage that. I don't really know what to do about any of this. I mean, I guess I could call the cops, but even if they believed me, it's not like they could even make it out here. The roads are impassable this far out. I'm not even really sure I'm in any sort of danger or anything really. That creature could have been as scared of me as I was of it. Who knows? All of this is so far outside my realm of experience, I don't feel confident enough to even guess. I'm sure as hell not leaving the house anytime soon though. You see, when I woke up this morning, all the snowmen had disappeared without a trace. The snow around where they stood is completely undisturbed. It doesn't look like they were knocked over, carried away, or anything like that. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not setting a single foot outside until I know for sure where they've gone. I was a house sitter for a time in college. It was easy money. Plus, I always thought of it as just like babysitting for guys. Try to get a job as a babysitter as a guy, you won't have much luck. Most college girls though, at least in my experience, won't watch houses out in the middle of nowhere for days at a time. None of the jobs I ever took were in the city. Either those people don't hire house sitters, or they don't hire strangers. I don't know. I used an app to find work, and no city jobs were ever posted. It wasn't unusual to travel an hour out to wherever I was sitting that weekend, but I didn't mind much. I got to see more of Kentucky outside of Pikeville, and the money was pretty great. Besides, I got to hang out in big, nice houses, eat other people's food, and get paid to do nothing. Honestly, it was a pretty sweet gig. I tried to go back to it once for some extra money, but, well, let's just say I realized I couldn't. Truth be told, I can't really travel to strange places at all anymore. That one that broke me was just a little further away than usual. About an hour and a half outside of Pikeville, just over the border of West Virginia. The town name was something like Lick Branch, or Flat Branch, or Red Branch, something like that. It's not like I can go back and look, but it was something branch. Maybe Red Flats Branch. I think that was it. Red Flats Branch. It was a long, long way from the interstate, down those old Kentucky roads that swing back and forth, and turn this way and that, until you can't really tell which way you're going anymore. Like I told the police though, I didn't really notice anything strange driving in, except for a little stretch of road just outside the limits, where the road straightened out between two separate sets of mountains. It ran straight through the valley for about a mile. Rolling up and down over little hills. 3 huge billboards stood on the right side, and all of them were painted white. For some reason, that unnerved the hell out of me. All the metal was rusted and everything, but the white paint was so fresh I could almost imagine Tom Sawyer dangling his feet over the platform, chewing on an apple and laughing at me while I passed underneath the creaking, rusting structures. Just past them, I saw the little sign that named the town, an old white thing, hand-painted and flaked gold lettering with a trellis beneath it. Like those old welcome signs towns used to have in the 1920s. Red Flats Branch. Beneath the name, it said established, but the numbers had long ago flaked away. Beyond the sign, 2 large willow trees stood on either side of the road. It was about then I realized that my GPS had cut out. My little blue cursor stopped moving, and then the map went gray. I tapped it, tried turning the cellular data off and on again. Nothing. I passed the willow trees, and the drooping branches drew back like a curtain to reveal the little town. It was, in a word, absolutely adorable. The summer afternoon was winding down, and I passed people walking the sidewalks, mowing their lawn, and just relaxing after the heat of the day had finally broken, all content in their little world. Some people sat outside in the shade of a coffee shop's porch. Someone somewhere was cooking potatoes, and somewhere else, someone was frying bacon. The buildings were the old brick style, and there were just 6 of them. That made up the whole town. Just 6 buildings around a little single spotlight. And beyond that, little houses stretched away in neat little squares. Looked like the kind of place you drove through on vacation that gives you a strange nostalgia for a kind of life that, at least if you're like me, you've only lived in movies. I couldn't get the GPS to load anything, and decided the coffee shop was my best bet for directions. I parked on the street out front, and slipped a coin in the meter, but it fell right out again. I tried again and it dropped right through to the coin return again. "Them ain't worked for years, son," said one of the guys sitting outside. He had a big mustache and a face worn deep with laugh lines. He was the only one not drinking coffee, instead fingering the rim of a small glass of the kind used for absinthe and vermouth. I felt my face go red with embarrassment, then smiled at the old man and waved. "Thanks a bunch, man." He stopped me as I was walking through the door and held out his hand. "Actually, I'm the meter maid. You're supposed to just pay me directly." He laughed. I took the quarter out of my pocket and dropped it into his hand, laughing myself. "If I come out to a ticket, I'm going to know who to blame then." The interior of the coffee shop was well lit by the afternoon sun, as it filtered through the big windows at the front and was done up in soft, untreated wood that glowed in off-white. It smelled like coffee, but also cedar and bread. A girl with dark black tattoos down one arm and leg and dark hair pinned up in a messy bun popped up from behind the counter with a smile. "Hey there," she said. "How can I help you?" I've never been good with cute girls, and God was she ever cute. Worse, it was that bouncy, mousy sort of cute that looks effortless. She raised an eyebrow and waited. Hi. I wanted to pick up a coffee and also possibly ask for directions, if that's okay." "GPS stopped working?" she asked. "Yeah." She nodded and pulled a plastic cup from a stack, then filled it with cold coffee. "I assume you want it iced?" "Yeah, please." "Cream?" "No, thanks." She poured a heavy dose of cream into the coffee and slid it across the counter, then leaned over with a smile. "There's the coffee, and now, where are you going to?" I showed her the address of the house. I was really glad I'd scribbled it down before leaving. She looked at it and frowned. "That doesn't look good," I joked. She looked up, still frowning. "You know the Jacobs?" "No, I'm just up from Pikeville house sitting. Never been there before." She stared at me for another moment before apparently realizing I wasn't lying to her. She nodded and her smile slowly came back as she gave me directions. The house, as it turned out, was just 2 streets over. After she finished, I tried to think of something else to say as the silence stretched on for just a second too long. I watched the dust floating through the rays of light from the window. You don't like the Jacobs?" She looked up at the ceiling, clearly choosing her words carefully. "They're just a little different from the rest of town. A little uppity, if you catch my drift." "Ah, yeah." She tossed an empty cup into the garbage and looked at me with a shrug. "Let me put it to you this way. There's a reason they hired someone from Pikeville to watch their house, when there's plenty of people here that could do it." "Yeah, that makes sense." "No offense or anything." No, I know. It makes sense. I don't want to make trouble or anything, though." She waved. "No big deal. You couldn't know. Maybe just keep it to yourself that you're here for the Jacobs." "Yeah, thanks for that. Don't worry about it." The Jacobs house was a little square thing in a little square yard. It was painted bright cherry red with bright white shutters and white wicker rockers on the little front porch. The windows let in lots of afternoon light, and that made the living room glow gold. A faint smell of pipe tobacco lingered in the air over the smell of cumin and must. On the table in the kitchen, my employers had left me a scribbled note. "Dear Connor, thank you so much for watching the place for us over the weekend. We really appreciate you driving all this way. We've left half the money on the counter, and we'll bring the other half on Sunday when we get back. If you have any trouble, don't hesitate to call us. There's nothing crazy you really need to know or anything, but if you're trying to get hot water in the bathroom sink, turn the hot water on in the bath for a minute, and it'll heat up a lot quicker. Old houses, you know. The Wi-Fi password is on the fridge. Signal here is a little iffy, so just stay on Wi-Fi as much as you can. Red Flat doesn't have all that much since the mine's shut down, but it's still a wonderful little place. Thanks so much. John. P.S. The town is quiet and safe, but we do recommend having the doors locked by midnight. Just ignore the whites." What in the absolute fuck did that last part mean? I looked at the note again and noticed it was capitalized. The whites. The neighbors, maybe? I wished I'd gotten that girl's name at the coffee shop. Maybe her last name was White. Maybe I'd walked into some kind of Hatfield-McCoy small-town blood feud. I shrugged. Whatever weird spat was going on here between the Jacobs and the rest of the town, I was just gonna take the coffee shop girl's advice, stay out of it. The sun went down and I realized the other side of large windows. They make you feel like you're being watched somewhere out in all that dark. The town wasn't that big, but I expected there to be some more light outside. The houses across the street all had lights on, or at least they had light on. Each one had a single light on, right where the living room was. No bedroom windows were lit, none of the windows on the second floor, and there were only a few street lamps. I poured a drink and sat outside in one of the big wicker rockers. A slight breeze blew across the porch, and people walked past, but no matter how long I looked, I didn't see anyone in any of the houses. No shadows, no movement, nothing. Not even any flashing lights from televisions. Just a single light in the living room window for every single house. They had a liquor cabinet full of incredibly expensive whiskey. I decided to order a pizza before I started really sampling. The closest place was about 14 miles away, a little place called Don John's. "I'd like to place an order," I said.
Carry out or delivery?
"Delivery." The guy on the other side sounded as if he'd had a cigarette in his mouth every waking moment for 20, maybe 30 years. He also had that old New York accent that sounded like he definitely dissolved a guy in acid before.
What can I get for you, Chief?
"Large pepperoni, extra cheese."
Large heart attack? That it?
I blinked, trying to decide between ignoring the comment or playing along. Can I get a medium stroke on the side?"
Hey buddy, listen. Don't be a smartass. You want anything else?
Okay, wrong choice. Gotcha. No, that's it.
What's the address?
I told him. The line crackled for a minute, and I thought he might have hung up.
We don't deliver out that way.
Why?
Just don't. Want to come pick it up?
I sighed. Yeah, I guess.
It'll be $14. Give me 15 minutes.
Then, the line clicked and went dead. Asshole. The empty house didn't answer. The pizza shop was further into West Virginia, opposite of the way I'd came, but I had to drive back through Main Street to get there. The coffee shop was still open, and the lights from inside silhouetting the same 3 old men in the patio. People were still walking around, and some people were even still mowing their yards. One of the guys on his riding mower waved at me and smiled as I drove past. The road wound its way up and out of the valley, swinging around hairpin turns and rising and falling suddenly. The gas station / pizza parlor appeared so suddenly I had to slam on my brakes to not miss the turn. I swung around a curve and suddenly there were bright LED lights and old rattling trucks being fed gasoline by rattling old men. Inside, the pizza shop was swelteringly hot and smelled of grease and dough and fat. It made my mouth water even as it made me immediately start sweating. The place was empty apart from the old man who had taken my order. He wore an old white wife beater, and his arms were covered in coarse, dark hair. He was reading The King in Yellow when I walked in, and quickly stuffed it under the counter, like he was embarrassed to be caught with it. "I'm here for the heart attack. Yeah. He swung off his stool and pulled the pizza from the warmer. $14.10. I gave him my money, and he handed me the pizza, tapping buttons on the old register. "What you doing all the way out here?" he asked. "House sitting down the road. Why don't y'all deliver over that way? It doesn't seem that far." He frowned at me for a moment, probably considering whether or not I was being a smartass. He handed me my change and leaned back on his stool, sucking at his teeth. "We've had issues with delivering out that way. Some kids keep scaring our driver." "Kids?" I laughed. "What the hell were they doing?" "Why are you so curious?" he snapped. I shrugged and held up an empty hand. "I'm not, I just can't really imagine what a bunch of kids could do that was so bad that you guys would quit delivering there." He looked uncomfortable and shifted on his stool, tugging at his shirt. "Well, I'm pretty sure it was kids. The driver won't talk about it much. Something about weird people blocking the road and standing out in the woods or something, and he said they were dressed weird. Never got much more than that." He sniffed and shrugged. "Personally, I think he just smoked some bad weed. Maybe took a couple too many shrooms, but we stopped delivering out that way. It was the only way I could get him to not quit. It isn't easy to find delivery drivers out here, son. Not a lot of money in it. He paused and spit into a trash can. Besides, we've had incidents out that way before. Weird people out that way. I thanked him for the pizza, and he grunted. Back out in the truck, I saw him slowly slip the book back out from under the counter and continue reading. Like he was doing something forbidden. The drive home was uneventful until I got back to the house. I walked up the steps, and to find the door slightly ajar, a tiny little finger of light spread across the porch. I sat down the pizza and ran inside, thinking someone must have broken in, but nothing was broken or moved. I checked the door and it was still locked. That was when I realized I must have not closed it all the way when I left. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I beat myself up about it until I realized that nothing had been taken. Everything was fine, and I'd just have to be more careful next time. Nothing major. Everything was alright. The living room was big and open with a soft, comfy couch of the kind that you could really sink into. And I laid back with a pizza, a big glass of Dr. Pepper, an Angel's Envy, and cartoons on television. It wasn't long before the pizza was gone, and by that point my drink count for the night was sitting around 3. I say around 3 because everything had begun to turn soft and fuzzy, and there were a few sips of different bottles between full drinks. Sometime between the opening credits of the 4th episode of Archer and the Hulu commercials, I drifted off to a greasy, alcoholic sleep. I had strange dreams. I rolled over once and saw a pair of white shoes standing on the floor beside the couch. Attached to the white shoes were white pants held up by a white belt and a white button-up. Above that, a face stared down at me, painted white as a geisha with black lips peeled back over a stapled-on smile. The face never blinked, and even though I was sure it was staring at me, the eyes had the vacant, faraway stare of a corpse. It might as well have been staring straight through me. With a smile in the vacant eyes, it looked like some escaped drug fiend who, despite not knowing who or where they are, is somehow still immensely happy to be here. I registered this all in a heartbeat. I know because I became painfully aware of each painfully slow beat. It was just beside the couch, staring straight down at me. I screamed, long and loud. I screamed until I was out of breath even as I tried to simultaneously sit up, kick the thing away, and scramble off the couch all in a single motion. All I really managed to do was flail wildly and fall off the couch, banging my face into the floor. I had the sensation of waking up again and jerked wildly, banging my elbow on the floor as I tried to scramble backward across the floor toward the glowing safety of the television. Toward noise and comfort, I looked around the living room desperately trying to figure out where the thing had gone and what it was. Slowly, a voice somewhere far in the back of my brain began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, I'd been dreaming. I climbed to my feet, still scanning the living room and looking for, I don't know. The kitchen jutted off to the left, a simple little room I could peek into easily enough. It was empty. The hallway to the right led to the only bedroom in the house, along with the only bathroom. I always avoid the master bedrooms when house sitting, but now the darkness stretched off to the side, untouched by the light from the living room. I hugged the wall by the couch, well away from the hallway, and tried to peek down it, but after a foot or so, the darkness became complete and impenetrable. There was an overhead light in the hall, but I would have to reach out into the hallway to flip the switch, and I was so ungodly frightened of some unnameable thing there in that darkness that I couldn't bring myself to do so. I stared into the yawning void for a moment, trying to force myself to just fucking do it. Then, operating on some smaller, older instinct, grabbed my jacket and ran outside. It was nighttime. There was darkness all around, but it wasn't that darkness. There were also moon and stars, and the darkness outside felt softer, somehow, and not so alive. I walked to my car, but realized I didn't grab my keys. They were still sitting on the floor beside the couch. I looked back at the house, but now even the thought of going back inside seemed unbearable. I decided I would walk. It was around 1, and despite that, there were still people out, walking along the sidewalks and talking in low tones. Girls holding on to their man's arm, heading God knows where. I walked toward the coffee shop, thinking I might find some place open, even if it was only a gas station or a diner or something. Not one of the people out walking walked the same way as me. They all streamed past me away from town like rats fleeing a ship. When I got to the coffee shop, I found that, strangely, it was still open. In fact, 2 of the 3 old men still sat out front, though they all now had small glasses of alcohol. Bright, fluorescent light still streamed from most of the windows along Main Street, pouring across the cracked sidewalks. She was still working when I walked in. It had to be some 10 hours later, and she was still here, looking just as bored and just as sick of it all as when I'd seen her the first time. The light that earlier had made the rough wood look so rustic and warm had been replaced by 2 glowing neon signs on the wall that cast half the inside in red and the other half in blue. There were no overhead lights and no lamps, just the neon. She looked up at me with a tired smile. "Out for a midnight walk?" Sometimes you don't realize how much alcohol is still affecting you until you need to speak. "Sobering up?" She laughed. "Yeah, a little." She rolled her eyes and pulled a coffee cup from a stack, then ground some beans and let the machine drip espresso into the cup. "How are y'all still open?" I asked. Outside, the old men were trying to bounce a quarter off the table into an empty rocks glass. In the morning, we're a coffee shop. In the evenings, we're a bar. "And you're here for all of it?" "No, I just got shafted today. Fuck me for being a good employee and answering when my boss calls." She slid the espresso across the counter. "How much do I owe ya?" "Don't worry about it." "Oh, thanks. I really appreciate it." She smiled and shrugged. "If the boss says anything, I'll just remind her I wasn't supposed to be here tonight." Classic. I grabbed one of the coloring books beside the counter. At university, they had coloring books around a lot. I remembered someone telling me they were good for anxiety and calming down. I'd always thought it was a little bit of bullshit, but then again, I wanted to calm down a little. And who doesn't like coloring? "You mind?" "No, go ahead." She slid a pack of colored pencils over the counter. "Nice to have a little company." "Yeah, I'll bet." I slid the pencils out and laid them across the counter, then flipped through the book to find a picture of a wolf with lots of mandala-like patterns in the middle. I colored while she cleaned, and we chatted about nothing. One of the old men outside managed to bounce the quarter into the glass, and a loud cheer went up. "I hope I'm not that easily amused when I'm that old," I said. "Be as drunk as they are, and I imagine you will be." "Fair enough." She cleared her throat. "Hey, I hate to ask this, but can you watch the front for a minute? I've really got to go to the little girl's room." My face went a little red. "Of course. You don't have to do anything. Just make sure nobody comes in and, pilfers the register or anything." "Yeah, of course. Go on. Don't worry about it. It'll be me paying for my coffee." She smiled and nodded, then hurried off into the back, undoing her apron as she went. I went back to coloring. I had just finished the left eye when I heard the door to the back swing open. "That was fast," I said. Without looking up, I was tracing one of the outside lines with a blue pencil, focusing so hard on staying inside the lines that my tongue was sticking out a bit. "Yeah." Her voice sounded far away, like when someone's only half paying attention to the conversation. "You alright?" "Yeah." I took a sip of coffee. I was really beginning to feel a lot better now. I think part of that was that I was starting to seriously sober up. Things weren't so unbalanced. On top of that, though, the little shop was a remarkably relaxing place, even at night. The buzzing of the neon signs was nice and relaxing underneath the easy murmur of the old guys outside, and the smell of cedar settled my stomach. My brain was still drunk enough to make me think I might have a chance of getting this girl's number, if I could just be a normal, not creepy douchebag, so I tried to think of something to say. "This is a sweet town. Cute, I mean." Yeah, that was smooth. Good, even topic. Nothing suggestive. Just nice conversation. Damn, I'm good. "Yeah, we like it a lot," she said. That distracted, faraway tone still in her voice. "We? You and your, I'm guessing, husband?" I congratulated myself for being a smooth motherfucker. "All of us," she said. I was about to color in the last little piece of blue around the edge of a mandala when the end of the colored pencil snapped with a loud, splintering noise. "Here, let me get that." She reached out for the pencil, and I handed it to her. Alabaster fingers closed around the pencil, brushing my hand as I held it out. I followed the fingers up to a face that would have been bone white were it not for the red and blue lights. The face looked at me devoid of all expression, save for a wide, empty smile and dead, faraway eyes. This one looked like a girl, with braided white pigtails on either side, but still only human in the most tenuous way possible. I sprung back off the bar stool, stumbling and knocking over one of the wooden tables as I tripped. I must have screamed because, outside, both the old men spun around in their chairs. When they saw me sprawled across the floor, they hurried inside. As they entered, the figures slowly disappeared behind the counter, like that old mime trick where someone pretends to be on an elevator. It just slid away. "What the hell happened to you, son?" asked one of the old guys. It was the one from earlier, the one I'd given the quarter to. His eyes were a little unfocused, and he seemed sober enough. "It was... You didn't see the thing? Behind the counter? The girl? She was right there. Like, right there." I shook my finger, violently pointing at the counter as I screamed. They all looked at the counter, then back at me, then at each other. "You mean Sarah?" "No, it wasn't the coffee shop girl. She's in the bathroom. It was something else. She was all white, head to toe. She was right there." I pointed again. The door to the back opened, and Sarah came out, readying her apron. She saw the commotion and stopped, frowning. "What happened here?" she said. "Paul, you better not have hit him." The man who'd been talking to me must have been Paul because he leaned back and held up his hands innocently. "I didn't do nothing. We heard him fall and ran in here." She glared at them. "No, they didn't. It was right there." I got to my feet and marched around the counter to show them. "She was standing right here. Nobody saw her? How did none of you see her?" I turned to look out the window and realized that no, they wouldn't have saw her. The large espresso machine almost all but blocked the front window, and especially blocked the table they'd been sitting. Nobody saw her but me. There's something in this town. That's twice now. A guy and a girl. What the hell was it? I demanded. They looked at one another and, for just a flicker of a heartbeat, something passed over their faces. "You know what I saw," I yelled. "Don't you?" Sarah grabbed me by the front of the shirt and pulled me down until I stood face to face with her. She spoke quietly through gritted teeth. "Shut up. Now." I slapped her hand away. "No, what's going on?" The old men shifted uneasily. One turned and looked out the window. Sarah leaned in and spoke with forced patience. "If you want to live, you'll shut your mouth. Understand?" "Oh God," said Paul. Standing outside the window were two more of the white-clad figures. These two were tall, lanky men with white, swinging pigtails. Both had a single hand pressed against the glass. As we watched, they slowly leaned in and started bumping their foreheads against the shop window. Bump, bump, bump. "He let him loose," screamed the other old man. "He let him loose. Throw him out." "Paul," shouted Sarah. The man called Paul grabbed his friend and fit his hand over the old man's mouth, whispering something in his ear. "Get him in the back office," said Sarah, watching the figures in the window with an emotion somewhere between anger and fear. "Everyone get to the back office." I did what she said, following the narrow little hallway to the single door at the back. A single old light bulb swung from a string in the center of the hallway, the harsh yellow light painting the walls with a dirty yellow color. The office was a cramped, small affair, with a couch and a desk and televisions playing camera footage from the front. Paul dropped his friend onto the couch, where the old man began hyperventilating. Sarah came in last, closing the door behind us and locking it. "Okay now," I began, but she interrupted me with a finger to her lips. She walked behind the desk and turned the television screen toward me, gesturing to it. The front shop camera showed three figures standing inside, the two from earlier that had been banging on the window, and the girl from behind the counter. They all stared directly at the camera, directly at us, like they knew. What are they? I whispered. She took a long time to answer, staring at the screen with a severe expression. Don't know, she said finally. I frowned, but she shook her head before I could speak. I really don't. The story says they found them up in the mines a long time ago. They blew a thing of dynamite, and when they came back, found it crouching there in the crater. Coal dust on everything, and it was pure, shining white. This is crazy. This isn't happening. I stared at the screen, waiting, but none of the things blinked. You're not supposed to acknowledge them, she whispered. It does something. The more attention you pay to them, the more of them come. From the mines? They live in the mountain? She shook her head. They don't live anywhere. They just found the one in the mountain. I mean, they could live in the mountain. I don't know. Nobody knows. They just appear and then vanish again. Like ghosts, whispered Paul. Like ghosts, agreed his friend. The story says they found the one down there, and they yelled to the foreman up the shaft. When they turned around, there were 2 more, then 3 more, then 4, said Paul. The boys doomed us all, said the old man on the couch. Doomed us all, and you all know it too. You do. You know what happens to them when they get took by the whites. The color had drained from his face, and he was rubbing his chest. Shut up, Simon, hissed Sarah. She turned to look, and a silent question passed between us. What did happen to them? She shook her head slowly, and held up her empty hands to show she didn't know. When we looked back at the cameras, a 4th had appeared. That's the one from the Jacobs house. It was watching me sleep, I said. Paul nodded. That's how they get you. They catch you off guard, do something you can't ignore, something you gotta react to, and then they got you. Jesus Christ. You people live like this? My voice was shaking nearly as much as my hands. No, we don't, said Sarah. Unless someone wakes them up. She turned to me with an accusing glare. I didn't. The Jacobs. They said. And then I remembered what they did say. I took the note from my pocket and unfolded it. Ignore the whites. Ignore the whites. I didn't know what it meant. Of course it would be fucking Jacobs that get me killed, said Paul. Yeah, said Sarah. John and his goddamn vacations, said the old man on the couch. He was really massaging his shoulder now. God, my chest hurts. Just breathe slow, Simon. You'll be fine. It's just your asthma. A knock sounded on the door. A single, solitary rap that sent shivers down our spines. Don't answer it, said Simon. Sarah grabbed the front of his shirt and shook him. There's nothing there, she hissed. There's nothing there. You're hearing things, right? There's nothing at the door, so why would I answer it? He opened his mouth and closed it several times, eventually settling for a single nod. Any leftover color had entirely drained from his face. After the nod, there was another beat of silence. Then an eruption of knocks sounded against the door, as if every inch of the door was being viciously beaten, and any moment it may roll off its hinges or break to pieces. Simon yelled, a look of pure terror on his face. His fingers dug into the skin of his chest, and he tried to take a breath that caught in his throat. A low, gurgling moan escaped his chest, as he contorted and tried to rise from the couch, his eyes rolling back into his head. The gurgling moan turned to a rattle and, with a final dreadful twitch, he relaxed entirely and dropped backward into the couch. Dead as stone, an empty pantomime of horror firmly fixed there on his face. On the other side of the door, for the first time, the figures made a noise. They giggled with high, childlike voices. He's, said Paul. He's dead, I finished. Everyone shut up, said Sarah. We have to stop acknowledging the... She stopped and took a deep breath. Considering her words, that there is anything happening here. There's not. Everything is fine. She looked at both of us in turn. We all turned together to look at the door. We have to go outside, said Sarah. I'm good, thanks, I said. No, said Paul. She's right. We can't just stay in here. No, I'm pretty sure I can. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, then closed it while she chose her words. If you stay in here, she said, slowly and carefully, eventually, they'll start appearing in here, and you'll be alone with them. You really think that'll be good? She had me there. I knew, on a level hardly above instinct, if I was left alone inside that room, I'd end up like Simon. Hell, I'd probably end up worse. At least Simon had the good fortune to die first. What do we do? I asked. Paul wiped his sweaty hands on his shirt. Looked straight ahead. Don't react. Don't acknowledge the... He paused, just like Sarah. Anything. Don't acknowledge anything. What do you mean? What'll they do? At the word they, another cacophony of knocking sounded against the door. Sarah bared her teeth and made a cutting motion with her hand. Sorry. I don't know what'll happen, said Paul. I just know it'll get worse. Worse how? Worse. My heart threatened to jump out of my mouth as Sarah took her place by the door, her hand hovering just over the handle. Ready? No. Paul nodded and Sarah turned the old brass knob. She slowly pushed the door open. In the hallway, now stood a dozen or more of them, on either side of the hallway with a thin line straight down the middle. Some faced us, some faced the wall. Some stared straight ahead, their necks bent backward at 90-degree angles, like they'd been snapped. All of them smiled with eyes that saw nothing, and the light painted them the same dirty yellow color as it painted the walls. Sarah went first, then me, then Paul. As we passed the first one, a long, black tongue slid from its mouth and licked its lips. No other part of the thing moved. The muscles in the face didn't move, as if the tongue was a tentacle slithering from the mouth. Rather than something controlled by it, my head began to turn to stare at the thing, but Paul dropped a heavy hand on my shoulder and squeezed, pushing me on. Did you guys see that movie that came out the other day? Sarah said as we passed by the figures. What? That movie, she said. It just came out the other day. You didn't see it? I didn't understand what she was talking about. What movie? I saw it, said Paul. The scene with the music? Absolutely amazing. Oh, wait a second. I get it. Before I could join in though, we passed one of the figures. It leaned in close as we passed and opened its mouth. The same long tongue rolling out and dropping onto its white chest. From the same hole as that long, black tongue, a shrill, piercing scream sounded like a massive cicada. Yeah, shouted Sarah. It really showed what prisons do to people, and how we just sorta, forget them in there. I'll have to go see it, I yelled. Sounds like a really great story. I've seen the previews, but I haven't got the chance to see it yet. The screaming cicada noise stopped after we'd passed, and I heard the sound of a wet tongue sliding back into its mouth. We were almost there now. There were 3 more of the things on either side. Then, we were back in the coffee shop, which, from the hallway, looked clear. At the end, though, the last 2 sidestepped like well-trained soldiers, blocking our path and locking arms as they smiled those empty smiles. Don't stop walking, Sarah said, although her voice was shaking. I really think that's what the message for the whole movie was, Don't stop walking. There was something in our way, though. If we stopped, it acknowledged they were there. If we walked through them, just bumping into them acknowledged they existed, right? My heart dropped. We were screwed. Sarah was right up to them now. Here was where it all fell apart. She stepped forward, right into where the 2 stood, arms locked, and passed right through them. It was like she was walking through gray mist. They looked so solid, but the moment she touched them, they parted around her, and I could see her on the other side, like we were separated by frosted glass. I took a deep breath and followed her. Every inch of my body shivered and grew cold as I passed through them. The smell, though, was like the mist you get from standing beside a waterfall. It smelled fresh and good. It was strange and unnatural and made me shiver. I blinked and I realized I was through now, standing in the blue and red neon of the shop. Paul grabbed me by the arms and slowly pushed me forward. Outside, the gray light of dawn was starting to mingle with the street lamps. A man with a briefcase walked past on the sidewalk. I wanted to turn to see if they were still there, but I was frozen. I couldn't walk forward. I was too scared, but I was too scared to turn back to see what was behind me. Paul slowly guided me to a table. Sarah pulled a bottle from under the counter and poured us all large glasses of absinthe with a single ice cube in each. I sat facing away from the back hallway. Sarah and Paul on the opposing side, never looked over my shoulder. They hardly looked up from their glasses at all. I sat there, nursing my drink, my brain reminding me constantly that all of them, for all I knew, could be standing directly behind me, and I wouldn't know, couldn't know. And even if I did know, the only thing I could do was the same thing I already was, so I drank my drink silently. I was on the third when they came to get Simon's body. He had a heart attack, was all that was said. There were gestures, though, that indicated just what really happened. Raised eyebrows, bulging eyes, puckered mouths that couldn't say the words they needed. The EMS guy that carried him out, they knew. I'm sure of it. I saw it in their eyes as they went. They knew. Everyone in town knew. They just never could say they knew. That's the truly damning thing about them. You have to ignore them, but you have to talk about them to tell people to ignore them. Round and round it goes. A cycle without an answer, until they pop up in some poor jackass's whiskey-fueled fever dreams. He doesn't know what to do, and they've got him. I was probably over the limit when I drove out of town, but I don't think I could have done it sober. I don't think I could have done anything sober just then. Besides, on those old roads, the only person I was in danger of killing was myself. Paul walked with me to get my stuff from the Jacobs house. We didn't really talk. When we got to my car, he told me to come back if I ever got the chance, and he'd tell me about the town. He said there was a good explanation for everything. Promised there was. I don't think he really expected to ever see me again, though. When I drove out of town, the same way I came in. The billboards had moved. They were on the right side when I drove into town, but somehow, they stood on the right side now as I left. They were still painted that Tom Sawyer white, but now, sitting on the edge and staring blankly into the noonday sun, sat a dozen of the whites, kicking their feet back and forth in the open air. I didn't look at them. I don't know if writing this even counts as acknowledging them. I've sat in the dark this whole time, and every time my gaze starts to wander, I bring it back to the lighted screen. All that exists for me now is this little screen in this dark little room. If this counts as acknowledging them, they're probably here with me now. Dozens, maybe even hundreds by now. I don't know. Truth be told, I'm still too scared to look.